having agency over your life. Because as soon as, whether it's the processed food industry or the social media or technology industry, as soon as they have hijacked your dopamine system, from my perspective, you don't have free will anymore.
In a world moving faster than our minds were designed to handle, mental health is becoming one of the defining challenges of our time. Welcome to Mental Health in a Modern World with holistic health practitioner Greg Schmaus. After overcoming severe anxiety and OCD in his own life, Greg dedicated the past decade to helping others heal through a fully integrated approach to mental health, combining lifestyle coaching, psycho-emotional healing, mindfulness, and archetypal work. Over the years, he's facilitated thousands of sessions, guiding people back to peace, clarity, and a deeper connection with themselves. Each week, Greg shares powerful solo insights, conversations with leading voices in holistic healing, and immersive live coaching sessions that take you inside the healing process itself. New episodes every Friday. Follow the show and start reclaiming sovereignty over your mind in a modern world. Here's Greg.
Hi, this is Greg Schmaus, and welcome back to Mental Health in a Modern World. So today is a very special episode. It's our first solo episode together. And so it's just going to be you and me. And together we're going to explore the 5 key factors to restoring and optimizing mental health in a modern world. And before we get into any of that, I would just love to start with a little breath work together. So if you're not driving or operating any heavy machinery, if you could just put one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. And if you are doing something while you're listening to this, you can still just mindfully and consciously breathe, which you're doing at all times. So you can still follow along no matter what you're doing. So just take a moment and attune inward. Begin to breathe in and out through the nose. Begin to feel the rising and falling in your torso. See if you can feel a little more movement from the belly than the chest. And we're just going to take a few breaths, breathing in for a count of 4, holding for a count of 6, and breathing out for a count of 8. Breathe in for 4, hold for 6, breathe out for 8. One more, breathe in for 4, hold for 6, and exhale for 8. Then just take a moment, bring yourself back. One of the reasons I absolutely love breath work for mental health is the breath is one of the only involuntary and voluntary systems of the body. So, what that means is we can voluntarily change, control, or manipulate the breath like we just did using the 4-6-8 breath. And it's also involuntary, which means whenever you're not thinking about the breath, it's still happening on its own. So, it's part of the autonomic nervous system. And so the breath is really the main tool that we have to access and shift our autonomic nervous system. And remember, the autonomic nervous system has the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. The sympathetic is the fight, flight, freeze, facade, survival response. And the parasympathetic is our rest, digest, relax, and restore system. So we can use the breath to shift ourselves out of a fight or flight state into a parasympathetic state, which immediately shifts our perceptual lens of reality and the environment. Because really, at large, our autonomic nervous system is the lens that we perceive reality through. So, breathwork is one of the most important tools for optimizing our mental health and shifting our state and perception of reality. Now, just to lay a foundation, most of us know this, but rates of anxiety, depression, addiction, ADHD, OCD, bipolar, schizophrenia have all reached an all-time high. And a lot of it is due to the environmental pressures that human consciousness is under. And so, together, we're going to start by laying a little bit of a foundation before we get into the five key factors for optimizing our mental health in a modern world. So, it's important to remember that we are, from my perspective, four-dimensional beings, right? So we are bio, psycho, social, spiritual beings. And we'll break that down. Bio means we are biological beings, right? So our biology, our physiology is all connected and woven into nature. So we are biological in our physical form. We are also psychological. So within that biology, we have a brain, we have a mind, we have a psyche, which regulates and interfaces with the flow of information. We are social beings, which means we are relational. And this is relationships to not just people, but people, places, and things, especially the environment. And then we are spiritual beings, which means we are consciousness. We are beings, human being the biological, psychological, and social. And then the being the spiritual, which is we are consciousness. We are energetic. We are more wave than particle. On a subatomic level, atoms are 99% empty space. So we are really energetic beings having this human experience and form. So that's the four dimensions. We are bio, psycho, social, spiritual beings. And so we're just going to touch a little bit upon each of those, and then we're going to go into the five key factors. So biologically, we are expressions of nature, right? So what we are made out of is the four elements of earth, water, fire, and air, right? So your physiology, your tissues are made out of the foods, the plants, and the animals that we consume. You have this gut filled with trillions of bacteria, viruses, parasites, fungi, protozoa. And so we are one with nature. We are literally expressions, biological expressions of nature. And so we must live according to the laws of nature. Unfortunately, in this modern world, we have completely divorced ourselves from the laws of nature. We are not moving our bodies. We are eating processed food. We are not sleeping in harmony with the circadian rhythms of the rising and falling, or the rising and setting of the sun. So we are, consuming processed foods. We're overly sedentary, and our circadian rhythms are all disrupted, all putting huge amounts of stress on our biology. And as we put this amount of stress on the biology, we express symptoms of this stress, a lot of which are anxiety, depression, addiction, ADHD. Because when your biology is under stress, it triggers a fight or flight state. It triggers the sympathetic nervous system. And when your biology is under stress and you trigger this overactive sympathetic nervous system, it moves you into this perceptual state of survival. So, anxiety, addiction, overconsumption, all of these expressions of an autonomic nervous system that's out of balance, all goes back to a lot of the stress that we're placing on our biology by not living according to the laws of nature, how we're eating, how we're moving, how we're sleeping, how we're breathing, etc. Right? So the biological piece is very important. Now, psychological, obviously, we can make the bridge connection between mental health and our psychological state, but we're just going to unpack it a little bit as a building block or as a foundation. So the psyche really is responsible for processing the flow of information, right? The mind processes information very similar to how the digestive system processes food. So if you take this analogy of the mind being a similar digestive process than the body digesting food, food at its most basic level is energy and information, right? So food would be calories. Calories are units of energy, and nutrients are actually bundles of information that trigger the body to perform certain processes, right? So food at its most basic level is energy and information that the body ingests, digests, metabolizes, assimilates, and then eliminates. Now, when we're consuming information, let's say we're scrolling on our phone, we're also consuming energy and information, right? So the light coming off the screen, light is a carrier of energy, and light and information are what's entering your psyche. right? So energy and information comes in. So the mind ingests the energy and information. It then has to digest, metabolize, and assimilate the information. If you take the word information, it breaks down to the word information. So we have to take energy and information and put it in formation through a digestive process. Now, interesting research shows that the average person consumes more information in one day than our ancestors consumed in one lifetime. That's a scary thought. So, if we use this analogy, imagine consuming more food, or imagine consuming an equal amount or more food in one day than our ancestors did in a whole lifetime, and what that would do to your digestive system. It would blow your body to pieces. So, we're actually doing that to our psyches, which is a scary thought. And so, that overconsumption of information, that overstimulation, is really creating another form of stress on our biopsychosocial spiritual being. And so, this overconsumption of information, the overstimulation of the psyche, our neurochemistry is hijacked. Our neurochemistry is hijacked through the dopamine system. Our neurochemistry is hijacked through imbalances in the right and left brain hemispheres. Most of our education system and information consumption is all left brain dominant. So when we move into the left brain and create an imbalance with little right brain activity, remember the left brain is your linear, rational, logical, mathematical part of the brain that divides things into pieces in order to digest, right? Just like the digestive system breaks down food and divides it into its isolated components to integrate it, the mind has to do the same thing, right? So when we're left brain dominant, we see through the lens of divisiveness. We see this or that, right? We see left versus right. We see up versus down. So it's always dividing and polarizing in order to linearize and understand and digest the information. Now, the right brain is more about holistic thinking. The right brain is seeing the whole, the right brain is the creativity. The right brain relates to emotional regulation, creativity, and social connection. And so when we're left brain dominant, we create divisiveness. We can't see the whole. And this is why we're experiencing so much divisiveness in the world, because the left brain says it's either this or that. The right brain says, I could see this and that. And this and that are necessary for the whole to exist, which is what the Tai Chi symbol shows. Right. So due to the overconsumption of information, the overstimulation, the hijacking of our neurochemistry, and the imbalance in our hemispheres, left brain dominance, this is why the psyche is under so much stress, right? So you could see the biological being under stress, the psychological being under stress, and now we're going to go to the social piece. So when it comes to the social piece, like I said, we are relational beings and we're in relationship to people, places, and things, right? So the environment is something that we're in relationship. You cannot separate yourself from the environment. You existing as a physical being in the three-dimensional world of time and space, you're in relationship with the environment, and the environment has become incredibly toxic, right? So we have chemicals, we have pesticides, we have, a lot of increase in molds, we have electromagnetic toxicity, we have all of these, we'll just call them toxins in the environment, both on a chemical level and on an electromagnetic level, that are creating a lot of pressure and stress in the organism. So we're becoming psychologically and biologically toxic through the electromagnetics, through the chemicals and pesticides, through the also the flood of negative information, right? So media is part of the environment, right? So media pumps out 90 to 95% negative information. And all of that is fear based. And what that does is that also appeals to your sympathetic nervous system. It appeals to your fight or flight state. It appeals to your survival reflex, which is why it's so enticing and we get pulled towards it. We get pulled towards negative things because it triggers an alarm in our system that says, I need to know about this for my own survival. And so the media knows that, and it's what really pulls us in. So environmental toxicity, information toxicity, chemicals and pesticides, electromagnetics. These are all putting environmental pressures and stress on the organism, which is then expressing these symptoms of physical and mental illness. Right? What I said earlier, we are relational beings, so that also relates to people. Unfortunately, people are now just relating through devices, either connecting on social media, cell phones, text messages, going back and forth on WhatsApp or whatever it is, but there's really a lack of true connection. And even when people are together, they're still, staring at their screens. They're not actually connecting. So there's a huge lack of social connection, even though we're more interconnected than ever before. Right. So the social piece, we have the environmental toxicity, we have the toxicity of media, and we have the disconnection in relationships, which is creating a lot of social pressure and stress. Now, lastly, the fourth leg of the table, so to speak, we're spiritual beings, which means we're energy. And what I'm finding in a lot of the work that I'm doing, also in my own life, is we're waking up globally or collectively to the multidimensional aspect of ourselves. We're realizing that we're not just this single entity in this linear time and space. We are much more multidimensional. We are experiencing different timelines. We are experiencing different realities. We are experiencing a multidimensional existence within this physical form. And as we wake up to that, a lot of people actually express symptoms of anxiety, depression, depersonalization, even schizophrenia as they're waking up to the multidimensional aspect of their existence on a spiritual or soul level. So, this can actually create symptoms of mental illness, but it's actually a spiritual awakening process. In addition to that, as we're collectively raising the frequency of humanity, we're integrating higher vibrational states into the physical body and into a human nervous system, which can initially trigger a fight or flight or a sympathetic response as we're integrating higher frequencies, almost like more horsepower into an engine. And so that can also express symptoms of dysregulation in the human nervous system as we're integrating higher frequencies into our biology and physiology. In addition to that, the rate of awakening, especially in young children and young adults, is outpacing the rate of individuation and integration. So it's almost like people are waking up before they grow up. People are waking up to their soul essence before their ego structure has actually individuated. And it's also creating symptoms of anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, um, depersonalization, and a lot of these mental health symptoms, right? So the rate of awakening for a lot of children and young adults is outpacing the rate of individuation and integration, right? So this is, I just wanted to lay that foundation on a four-dimensional level of bio, psycho, spiritual, social beings, and why each of those levels, there's a huge amount of internal pressure and stress that's put on the system and put on the organism. So now we're going to go into the five key factors that I have found just through my own exploration to really be the key building blocks and essentials for mental health in a modern world. And the first is balancing creation and consumption, right? So we are creative beings. At our core, at our true essence, we are creative beings. We are here to create. We are even here to remember ourselves as the creator. So we're not just here to create, but we're here to remember ourselves as the creator. And we are always creating consciously or unconsciously, which is an important truth to realize. And so our culture at large over the last maybe 100 years, really the industrial revolution, is we went from creative beings to consuming. We went from creators to consumers. We went from creation to consumption. And as we made this transition from being creative beings to being creators of consumers, we created a lot of pathology. So we disconnected from our true nature, our divine nature as creators, which gives us a real deep fulfillment on a soul level. and we moved into beings that are consumers, which is really just the instant gratification of the ego structure. So we've been disconnected from our soul and really trapped in this box of egoic existence as consumers. And this really creates a lot of anxiety, it creates a lot of depression, a lot of apathy, a lack of fulfillment, and a lot of obviously overconsumption. And this has also hijacked our dopamine system, where as we're consuming, we're getting instant gratification, quick dopamine hits, but at the expense of true fulfillment, right? The act of creation actually takes time. So, the act of creation, there's a delayed rewarding experience, but there's really a true fulfillment at the end of the road, which really lasts a lot longer. The instant gratification is like a quick hit, like a quick drug, but then you're starving a few minutes later. So, this act of consuming but not creating has created a lot of dysfunction in our mind, in our body, in our culture, at large. One of my favorite symbols, and many of you have probably seen this before, is the Ouroboros, right? See, the Ouroboros is the symbol of the snake eating its own tail. And it's a very powerful symbol. And one of the reasons is it represents the law of balancing creation and consumption, right? The balance of creation and consumption is actually a law that we have to live by. So if the snake consumes itself faster than it can recreate itself, it destroys itself, right? So you see, if we're consuming faster than we're creating an imbalance in the law of complementary opposites, like the Tai Chi symbol, yin and yang. So the number one law of the universe is the marriage of complementary opposites always remaining in equal balance and equal harmony. So this balance of creation and consumption has become disrupted. And we see it psychologically, we see it physiologically, we see it environmentally. We're consuming the environment a lot more than we're regenerating. This is why regenerative agriculture is so important in the world right now, is because this expression of humanity as consumers but not creators is really putting huge amounts of stress on the environment. And so this Ouroboros symbol of the snake eating its own tail is really a central piece of something we all need to be aware of. So whether it's, for example, when you're consuming food, the act of cooking food is the act of creation, and the act of consuming food is the act of consumption. A lot of people don't cook their food anymore. They're, ordering out, they're doing drive-through, Uber Eats. So nobody's actually engaging in the act of creating. When it comes to food, they're just consuming. So food is a perfect example of how we've gone from creators to consumers. I love cooking. I love the act of creating a meal and then consuming it. And the funny thing is, the reward and the dopamine is so much greater when you've put in an effort to consume, or you've put an effort to create and then consume. For example, if you take the same meal, if you take a piece of chicken and some sweet potatoes, and you're sitting on your couch and you order it from your phone, Uber Eats, and they just knock on the door and deliver it to you and you eat it on your couch, your level of satiation would be very different than if that hot meal was waiting for you at the top of the mountain that you did a 6-hour hike to get there, and then you consumed it. That meal would taste so much better at the top of the mountain because there was an act or a process of effort or creation, whether it's cooking or traveling to get it, that allows you to experience the fullness of the experience as a consumer. And so the balance of creation and consumption, even information, most people spend hours scrolling on social media and they're consuming content, but they're not creating content. I love creating content like this podcast. This gives me such a feeling of reward, and it gives me so much more satiation than scrolling, watching these short Instagram reels, which gives me a momentary dopamine hit only to be left starving a second later, right? So you see the balance of creation and consumption, why it's so important for our mental health. The next piece is the importance of delayed gratification. Now, this ties in a little bit to the first piece, but delayed gratification and instant gratification, this all goes back to our dopamine system. So remember, dopamine is the neurochemical of motivation, of reward, of seeking, and of pleasure and pain. So it's the balance of pleasure and pain. And when we have this constant instant gratification, we're constantly getting these highly palliative, whether it's through food or media, dopamine hits in a matter of seconds. Now, historically, dopamine was an essential neurochemical for survival. Dopamine was what gave us the motivation and drive to go on the hunt, to kill the buffalo, to bring it back to the tribe, to cook it and to share the meal and the feast with the tribe and experience the reward of that consumption. Now, if we didn't have dopamine, we would have no drive to survive. They've even done studies where they sever the dopamine system or the dopamine pathway in mice, and they'll put food a few inches in front of the mouse, and the mouse will actually starve to death. Right. So without dopamine, there's no drive to survive. This is why having agency over your neurochemistry, especially your dopamine system, is so essential for survival and so essential for having agency over your life. Because as soon as, whether it's the processed food industry or the social media or technology industry, as soon as they have hijacked your dopamine system, from my perspective, you don't have free will anymore. You literally don't have free will if your dopamine system is hijacked because they have hijacked that primal circuit of survival. So they are literally controlling your choices if you are not taking agency over your dopamine system. And so this is why practicing delayed gratification is what allows you to reclaim agency over your dopamine system. And so by reclaiming agency over your dopamine system, you increase emotional intelligence. You increase the capacity for self regulation, nervous system regulation, emotional regulation, and responsiveness. You increase the activity of your prefrontal cortex, which is your executive function that allows for real clear choice when you practice delayed gratification and you have taken back agency over your neurochemistry. And also, delayed gratification increases the satiation and fulfillment of whatever it is. Like we talked about, going on a 6 hour hike and having a hot meal at the top, that meal is so much more rewarding than ordering from Uber Eats, where in a few minutes, someone knocks on your door and you're sitting on the couch eating that, chicken breast and sweet potato. And so delayed gratification allows you to reclaim agency over your neurochemistry, your emotional regulation, your nervous system, etc. So it's really essential actually for free will, which is something that we all want to have and reclaim. The third piece is practicing sustained attention, which is really increasing your attention span. So, in this modern day and age, especially with social media and short form content, people's attention span is completely diminished, right? People have a hard time staying with something and focusing on something for an extended period of time because their neurochemistry is so used to getting such a big dopamine hit within a few seconds and then a crash. So they need something new, something stimulating, something novel to bring their dopamine levels back up. So it's pretty much like an addiction where you get hooked, but your attention span has completely diminished. Now, sustained attention or increasing attention span is absolutely essential for creating safety in the nervous system within yourself and creating safety relationally, right? So, sustained attention or attention span is the prerequisite to establishing safety in yourself and safety in relationships. If you've ever noticed someone, for example, who has ADD or ADHD, they have zero capacity for attention span. And it's almost like they're constantly scanning the environment looking for potential threats. Now, a lot of ADHD is rooted in children that grew up in unsafe environments where if they focused on one thing and relaxed into a single point focus, for any extended period of time, they might miss out on a potential threat coming from a different direction. So your nervous system is very tied into your attention span. When you're able to focus on something for an extended period of time, it relaxes the nervous system because it sends a signal saying, we don't need to focus on anything else right now. Everything else is okay. We're safe to focus on this one thing. So, attention span and safety in the nervous system are absolutely connected. In addition to that, attention span in relationships is important for creating a safe, coherent field for social connection. So, for example, if I'm having a conversation with you and you're speaking to me and I'm distracted with a million things, it creates a lack of safety in your nervous system. It creates frustration. It creates this sense of I'm not seen, I'm not heard, I'm not valued. And so you could see how important sustained attention is when it comes to safety on a physical, psychological, and social level, right? So it creates safety within ourselves, it creates safety relationally, and it creates a sense of safety in relationship to the environment. Now, sustained attention is also how you raise your frequency, right? This is why, from my perspective, all meditative practices and a lot of spiritual practices are actually the practice of sustained attention. For example, meditation might be follow your breath, focus on your breath. When your mind wanders, come back to your breath, or repeat this mantra. When your mind wanders, come back to the mantra. Focus on the flame of this candle. When your mind wanders, come back to the flame or the candle. Focus on this movement if you're doing Tai Chi or Qigong. When your mind wanders, come back to the movement, come back to the body. So, all meditative practices are really the practice of sustained attention. Now, sustained attention raises your frequency or vibrational state. When you raise your frequency or vibrational state, it expands consciousness. So, you have a greater access to consciousness and higher dimensions of consciousness when you can raise your frequency, because you are essentially like an antenna, and that antenna is picking up just like an antenna picks up on different radio frequencies. You're an antenna picking up as consciousness different dimensions, different frequencies, different vibrations, and that allows you to have access to a broader range of information at the level of consciousness. And so this is why some people can connect to spiritual dimensions just through their own practice, through their own meditation. Obviously, things like psychedelics and plant medicines can do that, but we can do that ourselves through the practice of raising our frequency through sustained attention. Now, it's very interesting that we have this whole field of technology and social media, which is short form content, which is diminishing the human psyche's capacity for sustained attention. And it's almost like it's putting a cap on the frequency or vibrations that humans can actually elevate to. Now, this is why it's so essential to bring your awareness away from the devices, away from social media, away from short form content, and practice things that really create sustained attention, whether it's meditation, breath work, even reading a book, doing a puzzle, anything that allows you to focus on something specific for a set duration of time. And when your mind wanders from it, you really come back to it. That allows you to raise your frequency and expand the range of consciousness and the range of information that your consciousness has access to, right? So, practicing sustained attention is essential for mental health in a modern world. The next piece is spending time in solitude. And this is one of the most important. And the reason is because most people, with the amount of overstimulation, aren't really spending time alone with themselves anymore. Most people are strangers to themselves. Most people are afraid of themselves. Where someone might say, oh, yeah, I had the evening to myself yesterday, but you were scrolling on your phone and watching television. So you weren't really alone with yourself. So most people, if we go back historically, if you had an evening to yourself, you were probably sitting by the fire contemplating your life, processing thoughts and emotions. You're really with yourself. But most people are not with themselves anymore because they're carrying around these devices that are constant distractions and almost like surrogate relationships without the fulfillment of relationship. Right. So most people nowadays are complete strangers to themselves. This is why a few months ago, I actually spent 4 days in complete darkness. I went on a darkness retreat and spent 4 days in complete sensory deprivation where I wasn't able to even see my own hand in front of me. And the reason I did this is very interesting. I've shared my history in previous episodes of obsessive compulsive disorder, severe anxiety, things like that, where I was so afraid of my own mind. I was so afraid of myself. I was always spending my life trying to run or escape from myself. And I realized that I really want to overcome the fear of myself. And so, over a decade later, I find out about this darkness retreat, and I said that is a perfect catalyst to really confirm for me that I have done the work, that I am no longer afraid of myself. And so I signed up for 4 days, which was, 24, 48, 72, 96 hours in complete darkness, complete solitude, complete silence. And, when I was sharing with a lot of people, this is what I was doing. Most people were like, oh my gosh, that's so scary. I could never do that. Most people went into a fear response. And what I realized is, based on people's response and even my own fears or trepidations that were coming up, is we're afraid of ourselves. The thing that we're most afraid of is ourself, our own mind, our own emotions, right? Our own internal experience. And I really wanted to overcome the fear of that. So I went to an extreme measure, which was 4 days in complete darkness, to really overcome any residual fear of myself. And thankfully, I was able to do that. And it was an absolutely incredible experience. I'm going to do a podcast episode on darkness retreats um, coming up soon. So stay tuned for that episode. But spending time alone with yourself is how you really connect with yourself. It's how you really come to know yourself. And we're living in this world where everyone is trying to tell you who you are, right? Through media, through Instagram, through everyone's trying to tell you who you are. Nobody has an innate sense of self anymore. And also, there's an extreme sense of loneliness in the world. Even though we have all this social media connection, there's an extreme sense of loneliness and disconnection. And I don't think that's loneliness and disconnection just from others. It's really a disconnection from self. This is why they say solitude is the only cure for loneliness, right? Because loneliness is really the need to be alone to reconnect with yourself. And if you can't connect with yourself with the absence of others, you feel lonely, right? So nobody's really spending time alone with themselves anymore. And it's absolutely essential to spend time in solitude alone with yourself to know yourself. That's what you're here to do. You're really here to know and experience the fullness of who you are. And most people are afraid of that, which is why it's so essential to go into the cave that you fear to enter. As Joseph Campbell said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek. Right. And, in one of my, retreats of solitude, I had this intuition come through that said, when you're truly willing to be alone is when you realize that you're never alone, the paradox, right? So when you're truly willing to be alone is when you realize that you're never alone. And so when you're willing to be truly alone is when you realize that you are actually never alone because you are connected to all things through consciousness, right? There's a non-local field of consciousness that connects you to all things. And so whatever time and space you're in, you're once again a multidimensional being. So when you really commit to spending time alone with yourself, you realize that you are never alone, in fact. So that's number 4, is spending time in solitude. Number 5 is reconnecting with nature. We are so disconnected from nature in this modern technological world. And the disconnection from nature is a disconnection from our biology. It's a disconnection from our true nature as human beings because we are expressions of nature. So the more we disconnect from nature, the more we disconnect from our true self. And so by spending time in nature, We bring ease to the nervous system. You know, there's even research showing that forest bathing has a greater impact on anxiety and depression than antidepressants do, right? So they've put forest bathing up against antidepressants, and forest bathing wins in terms of efficacy. So reconnecting with nature is really essential to reconnecting with reality and reconnecting with your true nature. It's not surprising that the word nature is in true nature, right? So when we reconnect with nature, we reconnect with reality, we reconnect with our true nature, we bring cortisol levels down, we drain the pollution and inflammation from electromagnetics, we boost our immune system, we boost endorphins, we boost all of these neurotransmitters and hormones that are essential for our well-being when we spend time in nature. So to get the hell off of devices after you finish this podcast and get out in nature and spend time, without screens, without input, just connecting with the natural world that is connecting with reality. It's connecting with your true nature. When you spend time in nature and connect with reality and your true nature, you remember your original frequency. Your original frequency is who you are at your core nature, as frequency, as energy, as your experience as consciousness prior to all the wounding, all the indoctrination, all the programming, all the conditioning, and all of the ways that we've adapted to a modern world rather than achieved optimal mental health and wellness in this modern world. So just in summary, the 5 keys to mental health in a modern world: balance, creation, and consumption. Make sure you're creating just as much as you're consuming, so you remain the Ouroboros that is creating and consuming at the fast pace, so you don't become the snake that eats its own tail and moves into self-destruction. Number 2 is to practice delayed gratification so you can reclaim your neurochemistry, increase emotional intelligence, self regulation, impulse control, executive prefrontal cortex function, and increase the fulfillment and satiation of the reward when you delay gratification, reclaiming free will through your own neurochemistry. Practicing sustained attention. Remember, sustained attention creates safety, both in yourself, in the environment, and relationally. Practicing sustained attention raises your frequency and vibration, which expands the field of consciousness that you have access to. Number 4 is to reconnect with nature, to ground yourself in reality, to connect with your true nature, your true frequency, and then to spend time in solitude so you can reconnect with yourself in a world that's trying to constantly pull you out and away from yourself. So, these are the 5 key factors to achieving and optimizing mental health in a modern world. So, what I would invite you to do is maybe take out a pen and paper and write down one thing that you can do for each of those 5. You might say, okay, I'm going to um, spend 10 minutes a day just getting my bare feet on the earth. I'm going to spend 5 minutes a day focusing on my breath. I'm going to make sure I spend at least 5 to 15 minutes a day really alone with myself. And remember, you can stack all of these together. So you could practice breath work alone in nature and kill 3 birds with 1 stone, right? Then practice delayed gratification. So make sure that, for example, maybe when you sit down to eat dinner, instead of starting to wolf your food down right away, pause and take 5 deep breaths. That's a little practice of delayed gratification. So, 5 deep breaths before you start eating your meal, a beautiful, simple practice of delayed gratification. And then balance creation and consumption. Maybe it's cooking more and eating out less, just as a simple way of balancing creation and consumption. Or it's consuming less videos and maybe creating one. Instead of consuming a bunch of content, maybe you create a video this week, or maybe you write a blog rather than reading 20 of them. So choose one thing for each of these 5 key factors to really start optimizing mental health in this modern world. And if you'd like some continued support, you can reach out to me for one on one coaching at my website, healing40.com. This is really my area of focus, which is a holistic approach to mental health. And you can also check out my flagship 21-day online program, which is all pre recorded content, Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness, which is my flagship program. It's a 21-day mental health program that takes you through really the essential building blocks to achieving mental health, especially in this modern world. And it's all pre recorded, it's step by step. It takes you on a beautiful 21-day journey. And for all of our podcast listeners, I have a 20% discount code. So if you go to healing4d.com/HTM, and just use the code podcast, you can save 20% off for Healing the Mind, A Journey to Wholeness. So those are a few next steps for you. And once again, I invite you to subscribe to my podcast, share it with anyone that you feel might be supported by this content. I feel deep in my heart, this is not just my business, this is my soul's purpose to get this information and this content out to the world to really support people's healing, reclaiming their neurochemistry, and remembering their true nature as human beings. So I look forward to sharing more with you soon next week in a beautiful episode. I'm sure I'll have something for you wonderful. And I look forward to seeing you then. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Bye bye.